What secret did your family keep from outsiders? My parents gave my older brother a notebook to grade my daily performance, and only fed me dinner if he approved. The school counselor found the notebook in my backpack during a random locker search for vaping products, and I watched her face change from bored routine to something I'd never seen an adult express before. Horror mixed with confusion, mixed with what I now recognize as barely controlled rage. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers trembling slightly, and I remember thinking she must be cold because the heating in our school was always unreliable. I didn't understand that she was shaking because she was reading my brother's handwriting, his meticulous daily assessments of my behavior, his point system that determined whether I deserved to eat dinner each night. She looked up at me with eyes that had gone wet and asked in a voice that cracked slightly, "How long has this been happening?" I genuinely didn't understand the question. The notebook had been part of my life for so long that I couldn't remember existing without it. I was 14 years old and had spent the last 6 years believing that earning food through good behavior was how all families operated, that my brother Garrett's authority over my basic needs was normal, that going to bed hungry 3 or 4 nights a week was simply the consequence of not trying hard enough. The backstory requires understanding that my family looked perfect from the outside, the kind of family that neighbors pointed to as examples of good parenting and community values. My father, Richard Holloway, was a respected accountant at a regional firm, the type who volunteered for the PTA and coached Little League and always had a firm handshake ready for anyone he met. My mother, Diane, worked part-time at the church office and baked elaborate treats for every school function, her smile practiced and permanent like it had been professionally installed. My brother Garrett was 4 years older than me, a straight-A student who excelled at everything he touched, the golden child whose achievements were displayed on every available surface in our home. And then there was me, the accident my parents never quite let me forget, the unplanned second pregnancy that had derailed my mother's career ambitions and strained their finances during a difficult time. I learned early that my existence was tolerated rather than celebrated, that I needed to earn my place in a family that hadn't wanted me in the first place. The notebook system started when I was 8 years old, shortly after Garrett turned 12, and our parents decided he was mature enough to take on more responsibility around the house. What started as Garrett babysitting me after school evolved into something far more sinister, a gradual transfer of parental authority that gave my brother complete control over my daily life. My parents framed it as teaching Garrett leadership skills and teaching me discipline, but the reality was they had found a way to outsource their parenting to their favored child while maintaining plausible deniability. The spiral-bound notebook appeared one evening at dinner when my father slid it across the table to Garrett with the solemnity of a CEO handing off a critical project. "Your brother needs structure," my father explained, not looking at me. "You're going to help us provide that. Every day, you'll evaluate his behavior and assign a score. If he earns enough points, he eats dinner with the family. If not, he can try again tomorrow." My mother nodded approvingly while I sat frozen, not fully comprehending what was happening, but understanding instinctively that something fundamental had just shifted. The point system was elaborate and entirely under Garrett's control, which I realize now was the most insidious part of the arrangement. He could award or deduct points for anything he wanted, from major offenses like talking back or failing to complete chores, to manufactured violations like looking at him wrong or breathing too loudly while he studied. A perfect day might earn me 100 points, but I needed 85 points to qualify for dinner, and Garrett had endless creative ways to ensure I rarely reached that threshold. He would assign impossible tasks with arbitrary deadlines, then deduct points when I inevitably failed. He would wake me in the middle of the night to quiz me on household rules he'd invented that afternoon, deducting points for every wrong answer. He would claim I'd done things I hadn't done, and my parents always believed him over me because Garrett was perfect and I was the problem child who needed correction. The notebook became a weapon, each page filled with his cramped handwriting documenting my supposed failures, creating a paper trail that justified my punishment. The first time I went to bed without dinner, I was 8 years old and had scored 73 points according to Garrett's assessment, 12 points short of the threshold. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching my family eat roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the smell making my empty stomach cramp painfully while my mother refused to meet my eyes. "You know the rules," my father said, without looking up from his plate. "Maybe tomorrow you'll try harder." Garrett smiled at me from across the table, a small, satisfied expression that I would come to know intimately over the following 6 years. I went to my room and cried into my pillow, not understanding what I'd done wrong, not understanding why my parents were allowing this, not understanding that this night was just the beginning of something that would define my childhood. I told myself it would only happen once, that I would be perfect tomorrow and earn my dinner, that this was just a lesson I needed to learn. I was wrong about all of it. The escalation happened gradually, like boiling a frog in slowly heating water. The first year, I missed dinner maybe once or twice a week, and I learned to hide snacks in my room, to eat extra at school lunch, to drink water to fill my empty stomach at night. By the second year, Garrett had refined his system, adding more categories and more opportunities for point deductions, and I was missing dinner 3 or 4 nights a week. By the third year, he'd added breakfast to the system during summer vacation when our parents weren't around to notice, and I learned what real hunger felt like, the kind that makes your hands shake, and your vision blur, and your thoughts scatter like startled birds. I stopped growing at the same rate as my classmates. My clothes hung loose on a frame that was all sharp angles and visible bones. Teachers occasionally asked if everything was okay at home, and I'd learned the script my parents had drilled into me. I was just a picky eater. I had a fast metabolism. I was going through a growth phase. The lies came easy because the truth was unthinkable, because I still believed on some level that I deserved this, that if I just tried harder, I could earn enough points to eat like a normal person. The strange details started piling up in ways I couldn't ignore by the time I was 11. Garrett had started adding new rules without telling me, then punishing me for breaking them, a Kafka-esque trap where ignorance was no excuse and the goalposts moved constantly. He'd started timing my bathroom breaks and deducting points if I took too long. He'd started requiring me to ask permission before speaking in the house, then denying permission more often than not, then deducting points for the times I forgot to ask. He'd started physical punishments too, though he was careful never to leave marks where anyone could see them. A punch to the stomach here, a twisted arm there, always accompanied by point deductions that ensured I'd go hungry that night too. I remember trying to tell my mother once, showing her a bruise on my ribs that Garrett had given me for eating an apple without permission. She examined it briefly, then sighed and said, "You need to stop antagonizing your brother. He's trying to help you." The dismissal hit harder than any punch, the understanding that I was truly alone in this, that my parents weren't just allowing the abuse, but actively endorsing it. I tried to fix things in small ways that never worked, but gave me the illusion of agency. I created my own secret notebook where I tracked Garrett's point assignments, looking for patterns I could exploit, rules I could follow perfectly. I set alarms for every task, every deadline, every arbitrary requirement Garrett had established. I became hypervigilant, reading his moods and adjusting my behavior accordingly, learning to be invisible when he was angry and perfectly compliant when he was watching. None of it mattered. Garrett seemed to enjoy the challenge, increasing the difficulty whenever I started to succeed, adding new requirements faster than I could adapt. The game was rigged from the start because the point was never for me to win. The point was for Garrett to have power and for my parents to have a scapegoat for all their disappointments. I was the family problem, the reason things weren't perfect, the defective child who needed constant correction. As long as I existed in that role, everyone else could feel good about themselves. My failure was their success. The fourth year of the notebook system brought a new escalation that still haunts my dreams. Garrett had discovered that controlling my sleep was even more effective than controlling my food, and he started assigning overnight duties that made rest impossible. I would be required to wake up at 2 a.m. to perform pointless tasks, reorganizing his bookshelf, or copying pages from his textbooks, or standing in the corner of his room while he slept, demonstrating my obedience to an audience of one. The sleep deprivation compounded everything else, turning me into a ghost who drifted through school in a fog, my grades plummeting despite my best efforts, my social connections withering because I was too exhausted to maintain friendships. Teachers started calling home about my declining performance, and my parents responded by giving Garrett more authority, more control, more opportunities to punish me for failures they'd engineered. It was a perfect closed system, every complaint resulting in more abuse, every cry for help twisted into evidence that I needed stricter oversight. The physical consequences became impossible to hide by the time I was 13. The school nurse, a woman named Patricia Okoye, who had been at the school for 22 years, called me into her office after I fainted during gym class for the second time in a month. She weighed me and measured my height, her frown deepening with each number she recorded. She asked me to remove my shirt, and I remember the long pause as she examined my ribs, counting them like she was taking inventory. "When did you last eat a full meal?" she asked, and something in her voice told me she already suspected the truth. I gave her the standard answers about being a picky eater, about having a sensitive stomach, about not being hungry at dinner. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. But she didn't push either. She just handed me a granola bar and a juice box and told me I could come to her office anytime I needed a snack, no questions asked. It was the first kindness an adult had shown me in years, and I had to fight not to cry as I ate. The notebook was discovered during a routine locker search in October of my freshman year of high school. I'd started keeping it with me at all times because Garrett had threatened to add additional penalties if I ever lost it, and the school's random searches for contraband caught me completely off guard. The counselor who found it was named Dr. Amelia Thornton, a school psychologist with 15 years of experience who had transferred to our district just that fall. She pulled me out of third period and sat me down in her office with the notebook open on the desk between us, and I watched her read through page after page of Garrett's meticulous documentation. 6 years of daily evaluations, 6 years of point totals and deductions, 6 years of written justifications for why I didn't deserve to eat dinner on any given night. She photographed every page with her phone before I could object, then looked at me with those wet, trembling eyes and asked the question that broke something open inside me. How long has this been happening? What followed that afternoon remains the most surreal experience of my life, a cascade of phone calls and consultations and official procedures that transformed my secret shame into a matter of public record. Dr. Thornton called the principal, Dr. Leonard Okonkwo, a former military man who ran the school with firm efficiency and had no tolerance for nonsense of any kind. He reviewed the notebook photos while I sat silent, his jaw tightening with each page, his knuckles going white where he gripped his desk. Then he called Child Protective Services, and suddenly my quiet nightmare became a bureaucratic emergency involving people whose names and titles I couldn't keep straight. A CPS investigator named Franklin Ashworth arrived within 2 hours, a heavy-set man in his 50s with sad eyes and a gentle voice, who explained that he'd been doing this work for 23 years and thought he'd seen everything until he read my brother's notebook. He asked me questions for what felt like hours, patient and thorough, documenting everything in his own notebook while Dr. Thornton sat beside me, offering tissues I didn't know I needed. The official intervention moved faster than I expected and slower than I could bear. Franklin Ashworth filed an emergency report that triggered a home visit that same evening, but I wasn't present for it because Dr. Thornton had arranged for me to stay with a foster family temporarily while the investigation proceeded. I learned later what happened when Franklin and 2 police officers arrived at my house. My parents had answered the door with their practiced smiles, inviting the officials inside with the confidence of people who had nothing to hide. My mother had offered them coffee. My father had made small talk about the weather. And then Franklin had asked about the notebook, and everything had changed. According to the police report I eventually obtained, my mother had burst into tears while my father had demanded to know who had been filling my head with lies. Garrett had remained calm, explaining that the system was simply a behavioral modification technique he'd learned about in psychology class, that I had consented to participate, that any claims of abuse were exaggerations from a troubled child seeking attention. His composure had been perfect, his explanations reasonable, and for a moment it seemed like he might talk his way out of everything. But Franklin Ashworth had been doing this work for 23 years, and he knew what to look for. He had asked to search my room and found the hidden snacks under my mattress, the water bottles I kept for nights when I was too hungry to sleep, the journal I'd started keeping that documented my own perspective on years of abuse. He had asked to see Garrett's room and found a second notebook, this one even more disturbing than the first, containing detailed plans for escalating the system once I started high school, psychological research on breaking down resistance, notes on techniques used in prisoner of war camps adapted for domestic use. He had found photographs Garrett had taken of me at my lowest moments, emaciated and exhausted and broken, organized in albums labeled by year like some kind of twisted trophy collection. The investigation that had started as a response to concerning documentation had evolved into something much larger, a criminal case involving sustained child abuse, deliberate starvation, and psychological torture conducted over 6 years with the full knowledge and support of my parents. The foster placement was disorienting in ways I still struggle to describe. The family who took me in, Gerald and Miriam Baptiste, were retired teachers in their 60s who had been fostering children for 15 years. They had a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a refrigerator stocked with food I could access any time, and absolutely no requirements I had to meet in order to eat dinner. The first night, Miriam set a plate in front of me without comment, without conditions, without even asking how my day had been, and I sat frozen for so long that she gently asked if something was wrong with the food. I couldn't explain that nothing was wrong, that everything was wrong, that I didn't understand how to exist in a world where meals weren't earned through perfect compliance. I ate slowly, waiting for someone to take the plate away, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the punishment that never came. Gerald noticed my anxiety and simply said, "This is your home now. You eat when you're hungry. That's how it works here." I cried so hard I couldn't finish my dinner, and Miriam wrapped the leftovers in plastic and told me I could have them later if I wanted. The psychological evaluation came next, conducted by a forensic psychologist named Dr. Renata Kwame, who specialized in childhood trauma and abuse cases. She met with me over 4 sessions, each lasting 2 hours, using a combination of interviews and standardized assessments to document the extent of the damage. Her report, which I later obtained as part of the legal proceedings, described symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, severe attachment issues, and what she termed learned helplessness, conditioned through systematic deprivation and unpredictable punishment. She noted that my understanding of normal family dynamics was fundamentally distorted, that I exhibited hypervigilance and approval-seeking behaviors typical of abuse survivors, and that my relationship with food would likely require years of specialized therapy to address. She concluded that the abuse I'd experienced was among the most psychologically sophisticated she'd encountered in her 18-year career, describing Garrett's system as a deliberate program of psychological destruction disguised as behavioral modification. Her testimony would become central to the criminal case that followed. The legal proceedings moved forward on multiple tracks that I struggled to keep straight. My parents were charged with felony child neglect and endangering the welfare of a minor, facing potential prison sentences of 5 to 10 years each. Garrett, despite being only 18 at the time of his arrest, was charged as an adult with aggravated assault, unlawful imprisonment, and child abuse, the prosecution arguing that his systematic torture of a minor over 6 years warranted the most serious charges available. A family court proceeding ran parallel to the criminal cases, determining custody and parental rights, while the criminal matters worked their way through the system. I was assigned a guardian ad litem, a lawyer named Constance Adeyemi, who specialized in representing children in abuse cases, and she became my advocate in a system I didn't understand, explaining each development and ensuring my voice was heard at every stage. The pre-trial period revealed how carefully my family had constructed their facade and how completely they'd hidden the abuse from the outside world. Character witnesses lined up to testify on my parents' behalf, neighbors and church members and colleagues who insisted they'd never seen any signs of trouble, that the Holloways were model parents who couldn't possibly have done what they were accused of doing. My father's employer issued a statement supporting him, calling the charges a tragic misunderstanding. My mother's church friends organized a prayer vigil outside the courthouse, holding signs that proclaimed her innocence and suggested I was a troubled child making false accusations. Garrett's college had suspended him pending the outcome of the case, but his classmates started a social media campaign defending him, sharing photos of his volunteer work and academic achievements as evidence that he couldn't be the monster the prosecution described. The public support for my family was overwhelming, a wall of denial that made me question my own reality, my own memories, my own certainty about what had happened. But the evidence was irrefutable, and Constance Adeyemi made sure the court saw all of it. She presented the original notebook with its 6 years of daily evaluations. She presented Garrett's second notebook with its disturbing research and escalation plans. She presented the photographs he'd taken, documenting my deterioration over years of abuse. She presented my medical records showing chronic malnutrition, growth delays, and stress-related health problems. She presented Dr. Kwame's psychological evaluation and testimony from Nurse Okoye about her concerns over the years. She presented financial records showing that my parents had spent normal amounts on groceries, proving they had food available, but chose to withhold it. She presented text messages between my parents and Garrett coordinating the system, discussing my punishments, celebrating when I'd gone multiple days without earning dinner. The evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty, of a family that had worked together to systematically break down a child while maintaining a perfect public image, and even the supporters in the gallery went quiet as the documentation accumulated. The crisis point came when my father's defense attorney tried a last-ditch strategy that nearly worked. He subpoenaed my school records from elementary school, finding disciplinary notes from before the notebook system started that suggested I'd had behavioral problems as a young child. He located teachers who remembered me as difficult, as defiant, as needing more structure than average. He constructed a narrative where my parents were overwhelmed by a challenging child and had simply adopted an unconventional but well-intentioned approach to discipline that had been mischaracterized as abuse. The argument was persuasive enough that the judge ordered additional evaluations, bringing in an independent expert named Dr. Howard Greenstein, who specialized in family systems and behavioral interventions. For 3 days, I was terrified that this expert would validate my father's framing, would conclude that I had been the problem all along, would recommend returning me to parents who I now understood had never loved me at all. Dr. Greenstein's report demolished my father's defense with clinical precision. He noted that any behavioral problems I'd exhibited as a young child were within normal developmental ranges and did not justify the extreme measures my parents had implemented. He pointed out that legitimate behavioral interventions are designed to help children succeed, not to create impossible standards that guarantee failure. He observed that the escalating nature of Garrett's system was inconsistent with any recognized therapeutic approach and instead matched patterns seen in coercive control and deliberate psychological abuse. He concluded that my parents had not been overwhelmed caregivers struggling with a difficult child, but rather willing participants in their elder son's systematic destruction of their younger son, outsourcing the direct abuse while maintaining plausible deniability. His testimony reframed the entire case, transforming the narrative from tragic misunderstanding to calculated malice. And I watched from the gallery as my father's composed facade finally cracked, his lawyer's strategy collapsing under the weight of expert analysis. The criminal trials resulted in outcomes that felt both satisfying and inadequate. My father was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with the judge noting that his position as a respected community member made his crimes even more reprehensible. My mother received 3 years, her sentence slightly reduced because the prosecution acknowledged she had been less directly involved in designing the system, though she had fully enabled and endorsed it. Garrett's case was the most complex because he had been a minor when the abuse started, though an adult when it was discovered. After extensive legal maneuvering, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence of 6 years with possibility of parole after 4, plus mandatory psychological treatment and lifetime registration as a child abuser in our state's database. The plea deal spared me from having to testify directly against him, which Constance Adeyemi said was probably for the best, given my psychological state. I was relieved not to face him in court, though part of me wanted to look him in the eyes and tell him exactly what he'd done to me. The family court proceedings terminated my parents' parental rights permanently, a relatively straightforward process given the criminal convictions. Gerald and Miriam Baptiste formally adopted me 3 months before my 16th birthday, giving me a new legal family and a fresh start I hadn't dared to imagine. The adoption ceremony was small, just us 3, and Constance and a judge who had seen too many cases like mine and seemed genuinely happy to preside over a positive outcome for once. Gerald gave a short speech about how I'd brought joy into their retirement years, and Miriam cried while signing the papers, and I stood there feeling simultaneously grateful and terrified, waiting for the other shoe that would never drop. The Baptiste name felt strange on my tongue at first, unfamiliar and unearned, but Gerald told me I could take as long as I needed to grow into it. Family isn't about blood, he said. It's about choice. We choose you, and someday, when you're ready, you'll choose us back. The therapeutic work that followed was the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than surviving the abuse itself, because survival was just endurance, while healing required confronting everything I'd spent years avoiding. Dr. Kwame referred me to a trauma specialist named Dr. Isaiah Mwangi, a Kenyan-American psychologist who had trained in both cognitive behavioral therapy and somatic approaches to PTSD. He explained that my body held memories my mind had tried to suppress, that my nervous system had been fundamentally rewired by years of unpredictable punishment, that recovery would require relearning how to exist in a world that didn't operate on point systems and earned meals. We did exposure work around food, slowly dismantling the associations between eating and obedience. We did EMDR processing around specific traumatic memories, the worst nights, the hungriest moments, the times I'd truly believed I might not survive. We did cognitive restructuring around the beliefs I'd internalized, the conviction that I was fundamentally defective, that I didn't deserve basic care, that my needs were burdens other people shouldn't have to bear. The progress came in small increments that felt enormous to me. The first time I took food from the refrigerator without asking permission, I had a panic attack so severe I couldn't breathe for several minutes. The first time I left food on my plate because I was full, rather than forcing myself to eat everything regardless of hunger, I cried for an hour afterward from the stress of wasting resources I'd learned to see as precious. The first time I slept through an entire night without waking in panic, convinced I'd missed some required task, I felt like I'd achieved something miraculous. Dr. Mwangi celebrated each milestone while reminding me that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks were part of the process, that the goal wasn't to erase my history, but to integrate it into a life worth living. He told me I was one of the most resilient people he'd ever worked with, and I didn't believe him at first, but slowly, over months and years of consistent evidence, I started to consider the possibility that survival itself was an achievement. My biological family's dissolution continued in ways I observed from a distance, news filtering through Constance Adeyemi and occasional media coverage of the case. My father served his full 4 years because he refused to participate in required programming, maintaining until the end that he'd done nothing wrong, that the system had been Garrett's idea, that he'd simply trusted his elder son's judgment. My mother was released after 2 years for good behavior and promptly moved out of state, reportedly to live with a sister who still believed in her innocence. She never tried to contact me, and I learned from Constance that she'd told people I had been manipulated by social workers into making false accusations against my family. The betrayal stung less than I expected, probably because I'd never really had a mother to lose, just a woman who shared my genes and stood by while her sons destroyed each other. Garrett served 5 years before being paroled, his release making local news because the case had attracted significant attention during the trials. The coverage included interviews with psychological experts discussing the long-term impacts of sibling abuse and the failures of systems meant to protect vulnerable children. The public aftermath created ripples I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Thornton, the school psychologist who'd found the notebook, used my case as the basis for a statewide training program on recognizing signs of hidden abuse in educational settings. The training materials included anonymized excerpts from Garrett's notebooks, teaching educators what psychological abuse documentation might look like and how to respond when they discovered it. Franklin Ashworth, the CPS investigator, cited my case in testimony before the state legislature supporting increased funding for child protective services and mandatory training for workers on recognizing sophisticated abuse that doesn't leave physical marks. Nurse Okoye created a pilot program at our school district providing confidential food access to students who might be food insecure at home, no questions asked, modeling it on the informal support she'd offered me. My suffering became a catalyst for changes that might protect other children, which gave the pain a purpose I found strangely comforting. I graduated high school 2 years after the adoption, my grades having recovered enough to earn me admission to a state university where I planned to study social work. Gerald and Miriam came to the ceremony, sitting in the front row with cameras ready, clapping louder than anyone when my name was called. I walked across that stage thinking about all the meals I'd missed, all the nights I'd gone to bed hungry, all the times I'd truly believed I was the problem. I thought about Garrett in his prison cell, and my parents scattered to whatever lives they'd built on the ruins of our family. I thought about the notebook that had controlled my childhood, now sealed in an evidence locker somewhere, an artifact of cruelty that had finally been named and documented and punished. I collected my diploma and posed for photos and let Miriam fuss over my cap and gown, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, not because I'd earned it through perfect compliance, but simply because people had chosen to love me. The final chapter of my biological family story came 3 years after I started college, when Garrett attempted to contact me through social media. He'd been released from parole, his restrictions lifted, his debt to society technically paid. His message was long and apologetic, full of therapy language about taking accountability and making amends, expressing remorse for the harm he'd caused, and hoping we could rebuild some kind of relationship. I read it twice, feeling my heart rate spike with each sentence, then shared it with Dr. Mwangi at our next session. We discussed what responding might mean, what boundaries I could set, what I actually wanted from someone who had spent 6 years systematically trying to destroy me. In the end, I wrote back a single paragraph explaining that I wished him well in his recovery but had no interest in contact, that his apology was noted but didn't change what he'd done, that my healing required distance from everyone associated with my past. I blocked him after sending it and never heard from him again. Some relationships are too broken to repair, and recognizing that isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Today, I'm 26 years old with a master's degree in social work and a job at a nonprofit that advocates for children in the foster care system. Gerald passed away last year from a heart condition he'd managed for decades, and Miriam and I grieved together, two people bound not by blood, but by the choice she and Gerald made to open their home to a broken teenager who didn't know how to accept love. I still struggle with food sometimes, still catch myself calculating whether I've earned the right to eat, still wake occasionally from nightmares where Garrett is standing over me with his notebook, adding up points I can never quite accumulate. But those moments come less frequently now, and I have tools to manage them when they do, and I have people who remind me that I deserve basic care simply because I exist. The notebook system taught me that love could be conditional, that safety could be weaponized, that the people who should protect you might be the ones who hurt you most. But Gerald and Miriam and Dr. Mwangi and Constance and all the others who helped me survive taught me something more important, that broken things can heal, that chosen family can be stronger than blood, that the cruelty of my childhood doesn't have to define the rest of my life. Garrett told me once, during one of his late-night punishment sessions when I was 11 years old and had gone 3 days without dinner, that no one would ever believe me if I told them what was happening. He said I was too pathetic, too worthless, too fundamentally broken for anyone to take my side over his. He said the notebook proved I was the problem, that 6 years of documentation showed I couldn't meet basic standards of behavior, that any rational person would see the evidence and conclude I deserved everything I got. He was so confident in his assessment, so certain that his control was absolute, that the system he'd built was impenetrable. He never imagined that a random locker search would expose everything, that a school counselor would recognize abuse when she saw it, that the careful documentation meant to justify my punishment would instead become the evidence of his crimes. He said no one would ever believe me. Now everyone does. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.